But in these dangerous floodplains, they went alone. Besides hippos and riverine predators, another great adversary was lurking in the floodplains. See, a century earlier, a powerful new group, the Luyi, descended into the Bulozi floodplain. They were led by female rulers Mwambwa and her daughter Mbuyu Mwambwa. Now, upon settling the floodplains, the Luyi began incorporating indigenous peoples, the Twa, the San, and others, into a budding kingdom. Eventually, Mbuyu's son, Mwanasolundi Muyunda, aka Mboo, took the throne to become the first male leader, the Litunga. Under Mboo, the Luyi began to expand across the floodplains. The initial expansions, though, were due to a succession dispute. Mbuyu had about 10 sons and 6 daughters, and one of Mboo's brothers, Mwanambinyi, led a faction that broke off from the core Luyi principalities in the floodplains and headed down south and established himself near Sinanga, dangerously close to the incoming Hakamusuma migrants. The clash was inevitable. Now, Hakamusuma tried their best to avoid the plains and Luyi influence as they sought refuge in islands. Islands provided better security from attacks. They first wanted to settle in an island called Mbeta, which lies in the Diambai at the mouth of the Lueti. Now, their stay here wasn't long as they were dislodged by the Luyi and forced to move further southeast. They briefly settled in the islands of Sioma, present-day Sioma in Zambia. Now, some of them moved to the islands of the Longa and Mutonga further south. And there again, they were dislodged by multiple Luyi raids. After this series of raids, Hakamusuma eventually made for Ditomboro, which was east of Katima-Mulilo Cataract. Now, Ditomboro was an interesting place. It had all the makings of a refugee camp. It was like a melting pot of multiple splinter groups running from the plains, escaping the crushing hand of Mwanambinyi, who upon settling in Sinanga started subjugating many of the southern tribes. And among these were the Ngoya from Old Mbunda, the Sudea, the Khoisan, Hakamusuma also were among the recent arrivals. But among those groups was another Mbukushu clan called the Hakangondo. Their leader, one charming rainmaker and healer called Thinyungu. Now, Thinyungu was a celebrity. It was like a rock star, It was like an attraction at Ditomboro. He was receiving tributes, gifts for his rainmaking powers. Now, the Hakangondo were a Mbukushu-speaking group, but they had deep roots in the Tokalia lineage. They had lived alongside the Vekuhani, also known as the Basubia. in the southern reaches of the Zambezi Valley, together with their neighbors, the Baye. It's almost impossible to separate the history of these three groups. Although some historians try to claim a common origin, it is clear that the Yei, Vakuhani, and Mbukushu have separate ethno-linguistic origins. The three groups are simply, good buddies. They're the oldest Bantu neighbors and Zambezian settlers. They have a long history of coexistence, and some of them, their oral traditions point to similar places of origin because they were in the same places. Now, the Subia also once lived in Musuma, for example, and they migrated earlier. So, Haka Musuma moving southwards was not an uncommon voyage. Another important note, though, is the Vakuhani were amongst the most established and structured society. They weren't conquerors by sword, but by culture. See, before the rise of the Luyi, the Vakuhani were arguably the most dominant political force in the Zambezi Linyanti, especially in the area we now call the Caprivi Strip. Their polity was known as the Itenge. They traced their name to a leader named Ikuhani, who was the son of Itenge, their first monarch, and he led their migration from the Kafue River down into the Zambezi Valley and eventually southward along the river we now call the Chobe. Though to the Subia, it's still proudly remembered as the Ikuhani River. But then came disruption. In the mid-1600s, the arrival of the expanding Luyi kingdom forced many groups to flee the floodplains. Litunga, son of Ikuhani and the ruler of the Vakuhani between 1640 and 1665, led his people southward from the Chobe River into what is now northern Botswana, settling in the Goha Hills. With them came their long-standing buddies, the Hakangondo, the Mbukushu, and the Waye. These three communities lived together here for a time, sharing land, water, and the lingering memory of the North. Which is why later, under the rulers like Mwali and Shanjo, the Vakuhani make a bold attempt to return northward. They resettle at Kavimba, near Chobe River once more, but their expedition ended in sorrow. Shanjo died on the journey north near the Linyanti marshlands, and he was succeeded first by his son, Mwafira I, who proved deeply unpopular and was eventually deposed for his younger brother Nsundano I, who took power around the early 1700s. Now, he was known by another name, the Verenge, which means the pillar. Now, that name is important because it's from this lineage that a new title emerged. Remember the Hakangondo clan I talked about, who had been under Nsundano's leadership? They came to be known as Hakadiperenge, which is a nod to their association with Liverenge, the pillar himself. And a splinter of this clan is the one that eventually travels north once again, and it is this offshoot that arrives at Ditomboro under Thinyungu, where they meet their old long-lost siblings, the Hakamusuma, and this sets the stage for one of the most important coalitions in Mbukushu history,